Hey, welcome to Barrel Aged Faith. It's Kyle King, and today I've got an awesome guest, Michael Jefferies, traveling from Indianapolis to the studio today. And it's a joy to have you today, Michael.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kyle. It's great to be here.
We're going to be talking about some cool topics, particularly creation care, stewardship, and environmental work. What does it mean to be a Christian? And Michael is Catholic. I have become Orthodox. But we both are deeply rooted in the Christian tradition and caring about creation, which we see, of course, in the saints, the church fathers, the sacred scripture. You also see it in C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien. And this is actually how I discovered Michael, because he created a recent blog. I think it's called, The Good Steward?
It's called The Good Steward.
Yeah, Good Steward. So definitely subscribe to that on Substack, The Good Steward with Michael Jefferies. And it really caught my attention because he's looking at, caring for creation and environmental stewardship through scripture, our great tradition, and of course C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. So I was like, oh my goodness, this sounds kind of like a brother channel.
Yeah.
So I'm excited for your work. You've already published probably 4, 5, 6 articles, or maybe more than that.
I think I have 4, and they've been it's been such a blessing just to start working on that and really kind of putting this creative energy to work and talking about these things that I've been thinking about for years, and now to finally put it down on the metaphorical paper.
Sure.
It's just been a lot of fun.
Writing is really it requires a lot of work and time and sacrifice, but I think it's just so well worth it. So thanks for sharing that with the world. Now you did not grow up Catholic, you grew up evangelical, is that right?
Yeah, well, I grew up kind of in evangelical space, but I did grow up in the PCUSA, but it was a surprisingly conservative PCUSA parish. And
which is Presbyterian for those that don't
know. Oh yeah, Presbyterian Church
this,
USA, and that's you've got your your more conservative Presbyterians who are usually in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church of America, or the OPC, Orthodox Presbyterian Church. PCUSA is kind of more liberal a lot of the time, but I grew up in a really kind of conservative, really evangelically influenced space. And yeah, I've become Catholic since then, kind of through a lot of personal study. I actually got my degree from a Catholic university. I was a Presbyterian the entire time that I was there.
Oh, you were Presbyterian at Marian University?
At Marian, yeah. And I loved it. I actually traveled to all these evangelical schools. It's funny because except for Wheaton College, I really didn't like any of them.
Ah, gotcha. I went to Taylor University, by the way.
I visited Taylor.
Yeah.
And it was interesting, but I was really looking for studying hard theology, and it was either you've got just biblical studies or you've got philosophy, and they were oh well, if you want to study theology, then just study our philosophy program. And I'm yeah, that's not really what I'm looking for. And I found kind of a home at Marian University. And they had this very ecumenical approach to their theology. And I, for the first 2 years I was there, I really didn't feel challenged in my kind of evangelical assumptions. Sure. But kind of over time, really kind of getting back to the roots and really thinking about things like apostolic succession. And this is not really what the interview is about. But
No, it's all good, though, because pretty much everybody listens to Barrel Age Faith. This kind of stuff matters. It's a lot of people's backgrounds, so it's totally fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, cool. Well,
but I was also going to ask, because you grew up evangelical, and I also grew up evangelical as well. And for me, the thinking about the environment at any kind of theological, intellectual level really wasn't present. Besides, hey, God made the world, we want clean water, and that was about it. I didn't think about that a whole lot. And so for me, I had a whole nother story of how I discovered that. But for you, I think we were talking about, before the interview started, you were saying that you kind of grew up as an evangelical with that sort of air, right?
Yeah. And that influence was 100% from my dad. He cared very deeply about nature. His favorite author was Wendell, and he was reading him all the time, and I didn't really know anything about the guy. But my dad was a nature photographer, like kind of on the side, and all our vacations were going out to national parks and just kind of experiencing the glory of God and creation.
Cool dad, man. That's awesome. I love that.
He's really cool. It's like one of those things that like discovering that like my dad, of course, like everyone thinks their dad is really lame, but then I discover like, wow, my dad was way cooler than I gave him credit for.
My dad was actually cooler than your dad.
Yeah. And so he was a full-time engineer, still is, but he started really trying to put this like stewardship into practice at home, and so he started like creating this huge garden in our suburban yard, and we grew corn and tomatoes and watermelons and strawberries and raspberries and all these things. So it kind of grew up around that.
You got me hungry because I'm like in gardening mode with spring arriving. So
yeah. Well, that's one of those things that I'm really starting to like. I'm like, wow, I need to get out there and get in the dirt. So I've been weeding out garden beds and stuff like that, and getting ready to plant. And yeah, that was just kind of part of my air. And my dad also was a deep lover of Tolkien and Lewis, and I had these things read to me as a kid, and so this was just kind of like part of what I was around. But at the same time, we were also growing up right at this time of politically,
right,
where we were hearing all the time, right? Oh, we were hearing about climate change, because I was growing up in early 2000s.
Okay.
And Al Gore came out with An Inconvenient Truth, and then I grew up listening to Rush Limbaugh every day with my mom in the car, and I was hearing all about climate change and and all these environmental concerns and how they just weren't serious. And I just kind of, took it at face value that was the case.
So you've got like Wendell Berry coming into your air, but then also like Rush Limbaugh. And then this and political discourse is so reactionary.
Yeah.
Like, it's very reactionary and very divisive. And then when you get into like the world of theology and like why did Christ, why did God make us? What's our purpose? Why are we here? What is creation? It completely is another way to think.
Yeah, it totally leveled. Actually, what really got me really thinking about like, oh, this is like a serious theological topic. It was like always implicit in the background, but in kind of my life. But I read this essay called "Why Work" because my dad had this collection.
Why work?
Yeah.
Okay.
My dad had this essay collection from Dorothy L. Sayers called "Creed or Chaos," and I had this, church on fire on the cover, and I thought that it was an interesting looking thing. So at 17, I picked it up and I was reading through her essays, and I came across Why Work, and she is giving this, scathing critique of the pre-World War II economy. She wrote it during World War II, and reading her critique, and she is commenting upon the waste and the mounds of trash that we had piled up because we were living this very like wasteful way of life. We weren't respecting, the land, and the land has been, stripped of all its nutrients and all these things. And it wasn't an environmental essay at all, but what I was struck by was like, oh, like here's this conservative Christian woman who was friends of Lewis and Tolkien, who, I was kind of brought up in their rarefied air. And here she was essentially critiquing the economic system that we were living in, and I was being told is like the greatest thing that ever came about. And if you want to think anything about, maybe we should try living more simply, more sustainably, and maybe not all economic growth is good economic growth, and we need to, make sure that we're asking, like, is it going to bring about good things for the community? Like, that's something that is bad. And so seeing that, like, oh, I could be a conservative and also be concerned about what kind of impacts development is having and how it's impacting our environment, was really a big impact to me. It was very impactful to me. And then from that, suddenly I saw it kind of like shot through Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and the Silmarillion. And I was like, oh, okay, like all these people were kind of thinking the same way about this topic.
The same way that Dorothy Sayers was disturbed about what her world, what was happening in her world after World War II. Tolkien had that same. He was also disturbed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so that's a really cool thing that you were reading Dorothy Sayers when you were 17. Like, I didn't even get to her probably till even after college. I knew of Tolkien and Lewis, but not Dorothy. So she writes a lot of great things. Now I'm going to have to read that essay.
Oh yeah,
I haven't read it.
It's a great one.
Yeah. The way that you describe Dorothy is how I kind of encountered G.K. Chesterton. And so oftentimes we think of our economic growth in the models of either like capitalism or socialism. And Chesterton was like a whole new way for me to think about those kinds of things. And it completely relates to how we think of the land and our relationship to the land, but also our local economies as being actually the heart of the thing, like the family. Yeah. The family's the heart, the land, like, everybody having like a couple acres and a cow kind of model. But so Chesterton really helped me sort of get out of this political American gridlock of, left and right, Democrat versus Republican, and actually think, what does it mean to be a Christian living in creation, to have a family as the building block of society? What does that mean for also the environment?
Yeah. That's pretty much exactly where I was coming from.
So our conversation's really going to go that way. First, we want to hook you though about sort of where does this found in, like, what's the starting place in Scripture? Because you can reference saints and Lewis and Tolkien and all these thinkers and writers, but if we can't make a case from Scripture that this is also there, then we have no real strong foundation if it's not there. So where did you encounter this in Scripture, and also describe, when did you discover this in Scripture? Was it after reading Dorothy Sayers? Did you grow up with this sort of reading of Scripture? Or was it more in theology classes at Marian?
Yeah, well, I encountered it through N.T. Wright, and I was reading Surprised by Hope, which was like the first book that really got me like into theology. Like, I was kind of like on the fence about it, but I read Surprised by Hope because I had all these weird ideas about the afterlife, and I was struggling to see the Christian idea of the afterlife as being like something coming like authentically from Jewish tradition, because I learned that Jews thought about the afterlife totally differently than how I was brought up thinking about it. And then my dad had bought Surprised by Hope.
Again, your dad's awesome.
Yeah. And because Surprised by Hope is essentially trying to get our vision about the Christian afterlife away from this, worldly matter, bad, spiritual things, good. We're going to, shed off this mortal coil and, go off to an ethereal heaven with the Lord when we die. And it's trying to get us back to the biblical vision of, no, our bodies are actually, they're good and they're going to be redeemed and we're going to have a resurrection like Christ is going to have a resurrection, or we're going to have an embodied afterlife, which was just like totally reshaped everything about the way that I thought about, everything. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that he was talking about was, like, there will be a new heavens and a new earth, and the created matter is not just our bodies that will be there, but there will be there will be a world beyond as well that will also be physical, and basically the whole world's going to be restored back to the way it was meant to be. And because of that, it's actually, it's an important thing to take care of the environment. So, that was really kind of the first place that I encountered it. But, walking through it biblically, you have to go back to Genesis 1, right?
Genesis Creation. 1, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So that's really where you're going to find everything kind of laid out there. So, looking at Genesis 1, we see this kind of creative procession of the world being brought forth. And it's, biblical scholars have looked at this as really like the construction of a temple.
Mm-hmm.
So we see kind of the outer trappings of the world kind of fashioned, and then it's filled. And this is in a similar way, a temple has the outer fashions, the outer sections of it are fashioned, and then they're filled. So the sky is created in day 1. Day 4 comes around, it gets filled with the sun and the moon. Day 2, the seas get built, and then they get filled with the fish, and all the trees come around and all that. So, all these things then you have this refrain of, oh, it's good, it's good, it's good. Everything is good even before it has some kind of function to be used for by man. So God is seeing it's good. He's delighting in the creation. And then in kind of the final section of temple construction, you see that the image of the deity that the temple has been constructed for is placed. And that's what we find on kind of the final day of creation, is that God creates man in his own image to be kind of his representative in the temple that is his creation. So when we're trying to think about, like, what does it mean to be made in the image of God, and then how does that relate to the dominion that man is given? Well, it's to be God's representative in the world, that then, we then are to care for all these things that God declared to be good, and to bring them kind of in a right, harmonious order. So then you go over to Genesis 2.
Yeah.
And you see the land is untilled. It's, there's no, like, plants that can be eaten. And it says, because there's no man to till the ground. And God then creates Adam for the purpose of working the ground to bring about the land to its fulfillment. And because of that, you kind of see this relationship between man's cooperation with the grace that we have. Mm-hmm. So it says, there was no man to till the land, but there was also no waters to water the land. So waters come and water the land. God creates man to till it. The grace of God bringing forth the waters, the work of man tilling that land. Mm-hmm. Then the Garden of Paradise is able to come about. And so man's dominion then is his call to fill the earth, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, is then kind of this vision of, you're supposed to take the Garden of Eden, and as the earth is filled, the vision is then that vision gets expanded. The whole world is supposed to become kind of this garden that speaks to
you're expanding even though all of creation is a temple, you're expanding the paradise, and you're expanding his glory to the ends of the earth.
Yeah, and it comes through this kind of careful, wise stewardship over the land and rest of creation, that man's supposed to kind of lead creation up into this, like, praise of God.
The liturgical references are so important when you read Genesis 1 and 2, because, Western modern man really viewed dominion as dominate. Like, we have the will to dominate. God's given us the directive to dominate creation. And then you get carried away where you see these guys shooting buffalo, or bison on the trains just for fun.
Right.
It's just like completely carried away. Mm-hmm. But when you look at the liturgical sort of references, like, no, man was made to be a priest in God's temple, and he's offering up worship to God, and that's his main goal, is to worship the Lord. Mm-hmm. And when he cultivates creation and stewards it, and really even co-creates with God, right. He's bringing glory to God through those means as well. Like, that's actually how we worship God. Yes. Is by being like him. Yeah.
Yeah, that was something that I came across in St. Ephraim's commentary on Genesis. Is he views
you just got me real excited when you start bringing up St. Ephraim. Yeah.
he views, like, when he's thinking about the image of God,
yeah.
A lot of times we think of, like, oh, what's our image of God, is because we are rational animals, unlike the unrational animals that are around us. That's what gives us the image of God, which, like, totally, I'm there. I think that that's part of it. But St. Ephraim says, it's the dominion that man is given that makes us in the image of God, because, as God wisely rules over all created things, so man is participating in that by wisely ruling over this plot of creation that he's been given. And so when, like, to just purely dominate it and use it just for your own benefit is really an abuse of that idea of dominion.
Right. Yeah, it's really an understanding of the image and likeness of God in more of a dynamic way than a static way. Static was like, well, I just have this intellect that you guys don't, so I get to do what I want here. Whereas connecting the image and likeness of God to more of a dynamic understanding of creation and our role within it is really saying, no, we're actually only becoming who we're supposed to be when we act like God within creation.
Right.
And so you see God walking with Adam in the coolness of the evening. And then particularly with like St. Ephraim, you see actually this wonderful relationship between Adam and the animals and creation itself, which you also see with the saints of the church, where there is a harmony with creation. And so there's this really cool image in St. Ephraim where they come to like they're like kind of outside of the garden, and Adam's in paradise, and they're coming from all over the place to like come up and be named by him. When they look at his face, they actually kind of have to look away in a little bit of a way, not because he's terrifying, but because he represents God, like God's light is coming through him.
Yeah.
So he's this, kind of like how Moses spends time with God and he comes down from the mountain with the tablets. And you also see saints glowing, or Christ, our Lord, glowing from the mountain. So this is happening with Adam.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that they were like in terror of him, but they couldn't quite look at his face.
Yeah.
They viewed him as kind of a type of Lord or master.
Right.
But a king of creation, if you will.
Yeah.
And that was a really cool like text to find by St. Ephraim.
Yeah. I want to read I haven't read his Hymns of Paradise, but it's certainly on the reading list, so I know that that's a really rich area to explore. But that view of, Adam as this Lord and this priestly king over creation, I think, and even the animals wanting to look away, I think that like people like Saint Francis also really capture that view, because there are these weird stories about Saint Francis that, like, when I heard them, I'm like, that's like, these weird legends that pop up around saints, like, there's a saint who like allegedly swam from Jerusalem to England or something like that, and I'm like, that just probably didn't happen. But then like you hear stories about Saint Francis where it's like he like animals will, like, he will preach to the birds, and like it's not until he gives the birds a final blessing that then the birds will fly away. Or like he was like on a boat one day and one of the guys on the boat gives him a fish to eat, and he thanks the man for the fish, and then he just like tosses the fish back into the water, and the fish stays there as St. Francis gives it a blessing and exhorts it to follow God, and then the fish swims away.
Oh, fascinating.
And it's easy to be like, oh, that's just like a silly legend, but it's less easy to kind of write that off when you recognize that like those stories are coming from the earliest life of Francis. It's written 4 years after his death by people who knew him. And, for a person who becomes fully transfigured, who achieves this goal that we have of, becoming like God, having that image restored to that of Adam, where he's this priestly king over creation, for someone who achieves that to a level that is kind of beyond what we think, these are the kinds of things that we really should expect to see if someone's actually reaching that point.
Yeah, it's a wild claim, like, to make in the modern world.
Yeah.
Because I think the same things too. I mostly encountered what you're talking about through St. Francis, but then the work of like Paul Kingsnorth has really brought forth. I don't know if you've read much about St. Kevin. in Ireland. He's got some cool stories too, and he's more from like the 6th century in Ireland.
Okay.
But it's like a lot of very similar types of stories where like an otter would bring a salmon up to the monastery every day and feed them. And one of the monks tried to like kill him one day for fur, and then the otter just like left, and he never brought fish again. So Kevin's like, what happened? And eventually he finds out what happened, and he has this confrontation with this monk. And there's all sorts of stories about St. Kevin. He'd go out into creation, into the woods, and there would be certain woods where he would frequent, and there'd be these times where like the trees would like even kind of like bow down to him. Now, that's kind of a scary story unless you understand the context of Adam.
Right.
Remember when we were talking about the animals almost kind of like honoring and venerating him? Not worshiping, like not the worship we give to God. No, it's more of an honor, how you honor a king. The animals were doing that to Adam. Actually, St. Ephraim even says that there's a text of when God makes Adam that he calls on not just the animals to honor and venerate Adam, but also the angels. And like Lucifer didn't want to. And that was like, that's how he demonstrates the fall of Lucifer in St. Ephraim. But you follow these lines of like even there being this type of like relationship where everybody kind of knows their place.
Yeah.
And there's a harmony.
Yeah. And I mean, that's part of our call is, calling all of creation up in its honor to worship God. Like I think another great biblical place to look at is the Song of the Three Children in Daniel chapter 3, where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they've been saved from the furnace. Now they are coming up to honor God in this grand song of thanksgiving to him, and they call in with them every aspect of creation to join them in their praise, calling on everything to bless the Lord. And that's really, I think, a really good vision of kind of that priestly role that man plays over creation.
Absolutely. I'm so happy that you brought that song up because now that I've gotten more into like the liturgical life where I'm praying along with matins and lauds and all these types of liturgy of the hours, that song comes up constantly.
Yeah.
Praise ye the Lord.
Same.
Praise ye the Lord.
Yeah, I pray that I'm regularly praying through the office, and that's something that I come across all the time, and it's like, oh gosh, it's so beautiful. And I was just like kind of devastated one day to discover when it was at my house we tend to read the we usually read like the liturgical gospel reading for the day according to the breviary at dinner. And then sometimes my daughter's like, we need to read the next thing. Like, we need to read more Bible. And then, like, the first reading was from the Song of the Three Children. And I went to go look it up in one of our Protestant Bibles. And I was like, oh, it's not there.
Yeah.
Like, it was such a sad thing to find.
Yeah, it's in the extended editions of Daniel that make it into Catholic and Orthodox Bibles.
Right.
And it's one of the most beautiful texts.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah. So we should be singing it at church all the time. But for this interview, that song really shapes the heart of it. Mm-hmm. It's just amazing. I love it. All right, so we touched on Scripture. I was gonna when you reimagine Scripture compared to how maybe you were raised growing up with it, and you really see heaven and earth coming together at all these junctures, with the finale being the whole transfiguration of the cosmos, heaven and earth.
Yes.
Being redeemed, and Christ sitting on his throne on earth. It says he makes his abode with man.
Yes.
He says, behold, I am making all things new. Behold, I am making all things new. It just completely transforms your understanding of salvation itself and our relationship to creation. And so this is the starting point for the rest of the conversation. If you don't get this part, you're not going to understand the rest of it.
Yeah.
Because our work today is to take care of God's temple, and that is an act of worship.
Yes.
It's not an act of political activism. I mean, it is in the right sense, like political, taking care of the city, taking care of our way of life. It makes sense. But if you understand politics in the wrong kind of way, as just, divisive political rhetoric that does damage, well, then you're not going to understand what we're going to talk about the rest of the interview. So now, we also talked about the saints too in our tradition. What are some other documents or texts that you've run into throughout, East and West tradition that inspired you with this whole approach to creation? think it could be modern text too, Laudato Si or.
Yeah. Well, Laudato Si is there, but I mean, even more primordially was, I was in school and we were learning about, actually learned this through discussions about John Calvin, interestingly, but it has its roots back in Augustine. This idea of there's two books that God gives us, two books of revelation. There's obviously the book of Scripture, which tells us those things which we can only learn about God supernaturally, but then there's the book of nature. Right, this is a general revelation that's present for all mankind, and through nature, man is supposed to. One of the things that nature does is that it shows to us that one, there's something else out there, right? There's something behind all the created things that we see. We see that the world is decaying and changing. That means that there must be something higher. You get up to this idea of Thomas Aquinas' unmoved mover. Well, it's Aristotle's unmoved mover. But this was something that people like Aristotle was able to discern through the examination of creation, so that way he wasn't brought into paganism. He recognized that there was one God behind everything, and that's the God that we should seek to honor. So there's this idea then that nature is an evangelist. It's kind of the first primeval evangelist, and we see this in the Book of Wisdom, where it says, for from the greatness and beauty of created things comes a corresponding perception of their creator.
So you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then creation is a fifth gospel.
A fifth gospel.
Some people will say that about the Holy Land as well. Which is actually a related topic. We can get to that, but creation itself is a fifth gospel that people experience.
Yeah.
People who have never even read the Bible are in some ways reading the Bible by living within creation.
Yeah, and I mean, so from that, when we come to respect and care for creation, as Christians. We provide a certain witness because everybody who has some kind of connection with the good comes to see that creation is also a good thing. So when we as Christians are exercising care over this, this original evangelist, we start to, we're able to provide a witness to the rest of the world that this is part of what we're called to do when it comes to honoring God. Is we're supposed to honor this thing that we all recognize as inherently valuable, and I think that that's something that can really start to bring people in. So there's an evangelistic impetus behind care for creation as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. It really is. Where our creation, there's so many important points about creation care and stewardship, but even just our witness as Christians comes through with that.
Yeah, I mean, when we as Christians come through and we strip the land and leave it kind of a barren, desolate wasteland, and we say that, we're doing this to fund our own economic development and prosperity, and then we go to church and praise the God who gave us these good gifts that we now have at the expense of, the land and the people who lived there, what kind of witness are we then providing?
Sure.
On the behalf of those people?
Sure. Issues of justice and loving our neighbor is definitely a part of this, particularly with impoverished people who typically are the first victims of environmental catastrophes.
Yeah.
Some of the most polluted areas on Earth are also where there's the most poor people, because wealthy people don't want to live in polluted areas. I don't want to live next to a river with tires floating by, or a factory that's, polluting that whole area. And so the poor are oftentimes the first victims of that. And so you see Christ loving those people, spending time with the poor, the outcast, spending time in those towns that are outside of Jerusalem, with even leper colonies that are outside the city, because he loves those people. But they're also typically in areas that are the most, particularly in the modern world, Maybe not as much in the ancient world. Maybe they had a better life as far as being near the woods and all that. But in our modern world, they don't have clean water.
Yeah, they don't have clean water. I mean, and this isn't, just an issue like when we're talking about places in Africa or wherever, Southeast Asia. I mean, it's an issue here in like Indiana where Kyle and I live. Up in northwestern Indiana, there's these big, hotbeds of coal combustion residuals, which are major sources of, one, water contamination, but also like they have high rates. They're highly carcinogenic, and you have this like cancer threat and higher rates of cancer in these areas, and these are areas where poor people live, and they can't get people to come and take care of these sites and properly resolve these sites so that way they're not an environmental hazard. And I mean, it's still an issue that we continue to wrestle with even here in America.
Those are good points, and we can get really overwhelmed thinking about that. Like, what's the right thing to do? Is it like just getting the government to do everything to fix it? Is it am I by myself trying to fix the situation? Is coal like this evil thing? People have all these kinds of things running through their heads. And of course, these issues are complex. I mean, we don't have we don't have all of the easy solutions. But if we started with theology, just like what we were talking about, okay, God's temple, creation is God's temple. The church itself, like when we go to church and we worship the Lord, that is a type of Garden of Eden. Mm-hmm. Like that's like liturgical theology. Like the altar is sort of like Mount Eden, and what flows from the font, the baptismal font, and what flows from the altar are like the rivers coming off the mountain into creation itself. And so the sacraments and our worship flow out. And so if you have a church in these areas, it's actually our job to spread Eden and paradise to those areas. And there's a good example of I think it was a church up in Illinois, maybe not too far from Chicago, and they took over an area, like I think it was behind their church, a fairly contaminated area that the neighborhood was embarrassed about. Not just litter, but I think contaminated water, litter. It was a very neglected area, and what they did was they completely cleaned, the church completely cleaned that whole area up. They put in hiking trails, prayer icons. They created a wetland, which purifies water. Yeah. The cattails and all those wetland plants purify water rather than having contaminated water with mosquitoes, And I was just like, that is exactly what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Yeah. When you're coming through and the church is coming in and is like, exercising that care over the land, and now they're, like in this place in Chicago is, transforming this area of the land and making it beautiful and usable again. What a witness to the people who live there of like, wow, like these Christians are actually taking care of something that we all are benefiting from in a way that no one else was going to. Sure. I think there's something really powerful about that.
Yeah, and when you want to empower people to grow their own food, well, you don't want them to have to build a garden in their backyard that's contaminated with carcinogens, right? I mean, so there is this kind of role as a community that's led by, Christians who care. Like, well, maybe we need to do some remediation with the soil, bring in some fresh soil so people can be empowered to grow their own food. I think we can all get behind efforts like this without getting into this sort of, political reactionary climate. Yeah. So let's pivot to like Lewis and Tolkien, because this is like so much within their fiction and nonfiction.
Yeah.
What did you discover in reading Lewis and Tolkien in their magical worlds of Narnia, Middle Earth, or even just nonfiction? What did you discover about them that maybe inspired you on this topic of creation care?
Yeah, I mean, when I look at kind of both of them, one, I was like really struck with the fact that the way in which the world is, it's deeply enchanted with, direct divine care. So like there's this view that like the world, we tend to look at in our day and age, we look at things that like, like this is just a tree. This is just a river. It's just dead matter that serves some kind of purpose. But with Tolkien and Lewis, both their worlds, Narnia and Middle-earth, they're both brought about through a divine song. So, in The Magician's Nephew, Aslan walks through the world and sings Narnia into existence. And I think that's such a beautiful thing, because people have also looked at Genesis 1 and have noticed that from its repetition, this is probably, it's a song as well. So, this is actually a deeply biblical idea that, God is singing the world into creation. And it's like the nature then has this almost sort of resonance within it. And you find the same thing, of course, in the Silmarillion, where, Eru Ilúvatar, the god of Middle-earth, he brings forth his the Anur, the angelic powers in Middle-earth. He directs them in this grand symphony that brings forth all of creation. He even works through, the perverted, twisted purposes of Melkor, who becomes Morgoth and all these things, who is Morgoth. And so all of creation then is brought forth from this song. And I think, when you are out in the woods or standing on the top of a mountain and you see the grand beauty of the world, you can almost feel the earth singing. And I think that idea is captured in a very almost literal way in their worlds.
Oh yeah, no doubt. That's a great starting place, because it's deeply biblical, where, in John 1, Christ is the Logos, and he's the one that holds all creation together, right?
Right.
And creation is created through Christ. When you read the books of Ephesians and Colossians, it's by his word and his own being that all things exist and are being sustained. It's not just something happened and then he ceased being involved with it.
Right.
But in every moment, he's the Logos sustaining every second. Every tree, every being is being sustained by his power, his energies. This is definitely developed in the Eastern tradition in the energy essence sort of topic. But even God's own uncreated life is sustaining everything, every moment.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, I think that really kind of viewing world that way is, helps us develop kind of a sacramental vision of the world. And, I remember hearing a patristic scholar, Hans Boersma, I think.
Yeah, I have his book right behind you.
Oh,
Seeing God.
There we go.
Yeah. Was that the one you read?
No, I didn't read it. I actually heard him in an
You got to read that book.
Okay.
Even for this topic, it's relevant. But
yeah. One thing my dad also did, he listens to this thing called Mars Hill Audio, which I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's like NPR. I've heard it described as NPR if it was as smart as NPR thought it was. And the guy who runs it used to be on NPR, and then he created his own thing, and it was the primordial podcast. And but he had Hans Boersma on, and he talked about the sacramental vision of the church fathers, and how when they saw a ship mast, we see a ship mast, the church fathers saw an image of Christ, because the ship mast is in the form of a cross, and it's the cross which is guiding the ship that is the church forward into the world, and all these things. And there is a biologist, in biology, there's this thing that holds all of cellular matter together, and he discovered that it's in the shape of a cross.
Oh,
and it's
fascinating.
All of things are held together by the cross. And when I first heard this, my materialist mindset was oh, whatever. Right. It looks like a cross, it could look like anything. But then when I think of if the church fathers, were to know that at a cellular level, we were all held together by that which looked like a cross, they would lose their mind.
Sure. Cruciform.
Yeah.
Design of creation itself. Yeah, it's a very patristic, ancient, and medieval way of looking at the world, for sure.
Yeah. So I think that's just, I don't know, just really helpful way of looking at creation.
No doubt, and that is Lewis and Tolkien were medieval scholars, and they were totally shaped And so their fiction is completely shaped by the fathers in the medieval world of Christian thought. So there's a type of, you use the word enchantment, which can, again, sounds like a fairy tale. It doesn't sound like real life. But in the Christian worldview, enchantment has everything to do with creation care. Like they're related.
Yes.
But we've already described how, and that is God's own life is embedded. He's the one that's enchanted it with his own divine life. So that's how it's enchanted. But then we are to be priests who are offering creation up and even kind of sanctifying it, making it sort of more holy, or when it becomes contaminated, dedicating it back up to God.
Yeah.
Is another way of thinking about it.
Yeah. And I, kind of going into Tolkien, I think there's a lot in Tolkien. I mean, there's a lot in Lewis and Narnia too, that this relationship between man and animals, this idea of man as being like a priest to animals is really, I mean, incredibly central to the whole narrative, where you have, when the Pevensey children come in and are able to like take their place in Narnia as the kings and queens, like, the winter is able to subside, and now things are able to be kind of in this right order with man at the head of these intelligent animals. But when, other beings, other humans, right, there's like the Telmarines and the Lorman Empire and all this stuff. Anyways, the way that they treat animals, they treat them as if they're just these, dumb animals,
right,
and the resource, and just as resources, and then those animals start to become just dumb animals, and they lose their ability to speak. And when man is exercising his proper stewardship over nature, they become restored. They learn how to speak again. That's part of that renewal.
That's really powerful, because Father Michael Ward, who's a C.S. Lewis scholar, will talk about how Narnia represents like man becoming who he's supposed to be, like united in the heart or the chest. So like the witches of the north, like the White Witch, they're icy and cold, and they're addicted to like ideas, but detached from creation, like reality. That's why it's so cold and icy. Like there's no warmth to it. Whereas the people from the south are addicted to the belly, to like physical like desires. Like, I'm going to eat what I want, do what I want, don't care how I treat creation, not because of their ideas or philosophical thoughts, but just because like I'm going to burn tires because I can. Right. I'm going to eat this and eat as much meat as I want every second of the day because I'm allowed, because I want to.
Right.
Whereas someone who's balanced understands that restraint and self-control, number one, those are like spiritual disciplines and fruits of the spiritual life. That's a good thing, just to be a human that knows the Lord. But also, it's how we are like God, to show restraint, self-control, patience. And so when the belly and the mind are united in the heart, in the spirit, then we act the way that we're supposed to, and then we actually approach the land and creation the way it's supposed to be approached.
Yeah, that's all fascinating. I need to get into Michael. I'm actually, I'm reading like 7 things at this moment.
Yeah,
I'm actually, one of the things I'm reading is Planet Narnia right now. It's so good.
Well, this is like the, so Planet Narnia is like the scholarly edition, so definitely if you're watching this episode, I'll reference it in my description. You guys can buy it. But also, this is the more like shorter, reader-friendly edition, Narnia Code on Planet Narnia.
Oh, I didn't know that he had a popular version.
This is the pop version.
Oh, okay.
Planet Narnia is more of like his dissertation version.
Yeah, Planet Narnia is, I mean...
That's like research, level.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's insane. It was like one of those things where it's like, I've been reading C.S. Lewis for years, and I had no idea how central, like, astrology, which, I mean, goes all into this, idea of an enchanted world.
Right.
Is so central to Lewis, and I really had no clue.
And when I was referencing about Father Ward talking about like men with chests, that comes from Lewis's Abolition of Man. And so Michael Ward wrote a book called After Humanity, and I've interviewed him on this book. And it's in that interview that he talks about this whole like mind and belly thing. So Lewis really develops that in Abolition of Man, but that comes out in Narnia.
Yeah.
Well, it totally affects this environmental conversation. Like our role in creation, is it just to consume because we've got bellies like an animal or a virus, you just eat and consume, and we're in a very consumeristic culture?
Yeah.
Or is it, also we have an addiction to just ideas, cold ideas, and in many ways the environmental world may have good ideas, but they have no idea how to put it into flesh.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've really just started kind of this process of writing, but so I have like this document full of ideas of things I wanted to write about. So I have one that I'm working on right now, and when we kind of get into more about Middle Earth, is this idea of, we're at risk of becoming orcs, essentially. But I also think that for people like me, the big risk that I run is becoming more like a Saxville Baggins. You're a hobbit, and this is really the risk that Bilbo and Frodo find themselves in, is that they're hobbits, but because of they think like hobbits, but because of their affluent lifestyle, and they're actually kind of really divorced from hobbit life. Like, they aren't actively gardening, they aren't actively working the land, they aren't exercising the things that they hold so dear. They really just kind of exist at this ideal level, and I think that that's kind of a risk that people like me, people who are who care about the environment, who love ideas, who love theology, that's kind of the risk that we kind of can run into, is like, yeah, we get the ideas right, but it never makes its way down into, actually getting into the dirt.
Yeah, I know a lot of, you can see a lot of environmental activists who feel quite anxious and guilty and frustrated a lot.
Yeah.
Because there's not a vision for actually how to produce a way of life where these things can actually live.
Yeah.
And Lewis and Tolkien kind of provide that in an imaginative way. I love your example of the bad hobbits, who aren't living the full hobbit life.
Yeah,
and we all can fall into that sort of thinking that, like, this is what I want life to be, but I'm so consumeristic.
Yes.
How do I unhook from that sort of mindset?
Yeah. When you actually think about the amount of plastic packaging that you go through in just a day, like I was thinking about that, and I'm just like, how do I even get away from this?
Right.
I don't know. Unless I'm like literally producing all of my own food, which me on my 1/4 acre plot of land in Indianapolis, I don't know how I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
Although I have a friend who's really into homesteading. He does say that it is possible to be fully sufficient on a 1/4 acre, but
you'd have to grow a lot of food and use a lot of glass jars that you reuse, and you'd have to be really intentional. It's going to take time. I mean, how I think of this is developing practices that you can hand on to your kids, and they're going to build on top of that each generation after another, because we lost so much in the post-World War II, generation. We lost so many skills. We don't know how to garden. I think about this generation, they don't know how to cook. You don't even know how to cook.
Right.
Well, you got to do that first before you garden, because you don't even know what you're supposed to grow. So all these kinds of things are required, and so we've got to get back to this kind of back to the land movement, but it's going to take generations to do that. It takes one generation to lose it all, and it takes multiple generations to get it back.
Rebuild it. Yeah, and I mean, I'm glad that, I have someone like my dad who can like kind of show me. He would always be like, Michael, come help me in the garden. I'd be like, no, I'm going to play Call of Duty, actually, Dad.
Right.
I have no interest in this. But now I'm like sitting here being like, how do I garden?
Yeah.
Dad, help me. And hopefully, since I'm only 27 starting now, I can hopefully get a lot farther, before the end.
There you go. Some of the other examples in Lord of the Rings, Middle Earth, would be like how the elves and the dwarves and these other sort of races of Middle Earth relate to the land. How are these races that Tolkien has created, how do they depict their relationship to the land? What is he trying to teach us?
Yeah, he's trying to teach us that, he has this vision of, very clear visions of good and evil. And there are entire races that have given themselves over to evil, like the orcs. And then there are men who are largely caught in the middle. They're being pulled in both directions, and then, you know, even though like not all elves are good and not all hobbits are good, they are two races that have this much more grounded, sustainable way of life. So he's trying to teach us that part of living the good life is living in a right relationship with nature, with created things. And when we really get when we get out of balance with that, things start to go wrong. So part of that comes down to, you know, how are you going to interact with the land? The hobbits view it as unnatural to live in created structures. They desire to live in holes in the ground. Even though by the time of Lord of the Rings, most hobbits actually don't live in holes in the ground. Only the richest and the poorest hobbits live in holes in the ground. The elves live in a relationship with nature. You know, they live up in, you know, in Lothlorien, they've literally built their homes into the forest. So, you know, they live in this beautiful forest where the leaves turn gold in the winter. Instead of dying, the leaves turn gold. And then they fall in the spring. And to create their home, they would never destroy this beautiful forest. Instead, they build their homes within the forest. And then, you know, similarly in Rivendell, you see those kinds of things. They also, like the hobbits, actually, primarily, most of the elven kingdoms, their homes are actually underground as well. So in the Silmarillion, you see like the gray elf kingdom in Doriath. It's constructed underground. Thingol and Melian create this beautiful subterranean palace within this grand forest of Doriath. And then that gets echoed in another kingdom that gets created later.
So they're using like geothermal, like heating and cooling systems.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they had great heated floors, geothermal heated floors and all that.
Right.
So instead of looking at how do we clear this land and destroy these things that we love in order to give us a place to live, they think first and foremost, how do we live within the land that we already have? And that really does give us a lesson on how we can start to think about living more sustainably.
Yeah, that's so true. It requires more planning and more work.
Right.
You know, it's way easier to clear out a forest and put up a shopping center, and then you throw in a couple, you know, fruit trees to replace that forest or whatever. But it would if something is going to be built, why clear cut the forest? Why? It's going to probably cost a little bit more, but maybe there's a way to design our cities in such a way that it shows that we value this. You know, and it cuts down on mental illness. People that are surrounded by nature, kids, and have places to interact with nature are less depressed.
Yeah.
And so you're creating these cities where we can be fully human. And I think that's a big part of Lord of the Rings is they're not just doing this because they want to. They're doing this because this is who they are.
Right.
They are made to be sort of creatures living in harmony with this, and they're stewards of it, and they recognize that. And so our cities would look so different if we knew that about ourselves. We don't, and so we build cities in the cheapest way imaginable, but then we pay for it in other ways. Like our kids have mental illnesses.
Yeah.
And then we're paying for that in just a different way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, so much of you know, there's so much energy being put into like scientific research, which are really just focused on trying to fix the things that we've damaged, whether it's like to ourselves personally through like, you know, the fertility challenges that people are facing because of, you know, the chemicals in our water and all these things. Can go into that later, but Yeah, it really all does come around when you get out of a correct order.
Sure.
And you start to become less human, right? So in Lord of the Rings, the orcs themselves, they're like bent elves. They're elves who were taken, they were corrupted by Morgoth, and now they are really kind of unrecognizable. But they're in the movie, they're like viewed as like these almost like insect-like creatures, and they're only like residually intelligent. But in The Hobbit, it says that the orcs are actually, they're quite intelligent. They're really quite crafty, and that they're responsible for creating most of the machines that exist today. And they're using these machines in a way to get them away from having to work. They don't want to work. They just want to, be lazy, essentially, and they only look at brute function. And then you look at the elves, and like the care that they put into, there's artistry behind everything that they create. They're putting their love and care into it. The orcs only look at function, efficiency. And really the warning is there for us that like we can become like that, and there's kind of this corrupting influence that's being fought within men and within even ultimately the hobbits, as you see in the Scouring of the Shire, which is such an important part of the story, is that when we kind of stop looking at the land as this thing to work and care for and to try to pass on to the next generation, we start to become like these bent creatures, like the orcs.
Yeah, that's well said. Very well said. I think when I look at the architecture of the elves, they're almost building their buildings have a similar design as the forests.
Yes.
They point upward. They almost have this style of building that mimics nature, and therefore it's beautiful.
Yes.
And so there's actually like a science behind beauty. And of course you can study, I think there was a recent podcast with Jonathan Peugeot talking about how we've made our cities ugly in America. And one of the things that you love about beautiful cities is that they typically, in beautiful churches, is they mimic creation.
Yes.
And they look like actually the Garden of Eden. They look like paradise. And this is true in Eastern, Byzantine, Greek-style churches that are domes. You can find this in many Western-style churches too, on both the East and the West. There's one of their main
the pillars
goals,
are like grand trees.
Yeah,
that
with
direct our gaze upward and
vaulted starlit. It looks like the sky with like stars.
Yeah.
And angels all around you, and the saints are a part of this paradise.
Yeah,
and
I mean the
everyone's
parish
focused on
I
Christ.
actually have that. The parish I go to, St. John the Evangelist in Indianapolis.
Yeah, the beautiful
Go there.
paintings and icons of the angels there are awesome. I like them too. Been in there several times.
Oh,
yeah,
I love being there, and like to like expose your kids to that is such a special thing too. Like to see like I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and my 1-year-old just recently, when we're at mass together, she sit there and she just gazes up and she's just like taking it all in, and sometimes she'll just be like, "Whoa."
Yeah. Yeah, when my son sees modern churches, he'll actually, he's like 4. He'll say that's not, he's not convinced that they're actually churches. Like the kind of like blocky 1970s style. We're not trying to make fun of anybody here, but but what I'm saying is he understands beauty.
Yeah.
Because it comes from nature and it's innate in us, and he understands the sweeping nature of what, for him, this opinionated little 4-year-old, what a church should look like. I never even said those words to him. He just like came up with those words on his own.
Oh, no, yeah. I interestingly, I grew up in the PCUSA, but I grew up in an incredibly beautiful church that was created in like a neo-Gothic style and has, truly some of the best. I still think probably the best stained glass I've seen in America. And I called our church like it was like it was a real church, and like the other churches that we saw, like they weren't real churches, because they didn't have that beauty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're not trying to hate on anybody here, but what we're trying to do though is try to pick up on these patterns of beauty, and the elves mimic this.
Yes.
And it relates to how we think of reality, like the world. And so if we build buildings, a lot of times in the ancient and medieval age, you built a church to last forever. In the modern world, we build buildings to last for a few decades.
Yeah.
And so that affects how you, if you're going to build a building that's supposed to only last for 20, 30 years, then you're just updating, you're just going with the latest fads in design.
Yeah.
When you build a church that's supposed to last thousands of years, you build it in harmony with nature. So you don't have to let's do an update inside every 10 years. No.
Right.
You build it basically you're building it like the elves. Okay. None of our questions here talk about church architecture, but it went that way. I wonder, before we move on and get out of Middle Earth and Narnia, I did want to bring up Saruman.
Yes.
Because he's someone that relates to creation the right way, and then you see his fall.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how does he represent sort of like this bentness or turning away from his call as sort of Adam, temple priest figure?
Yeah, I mean, he is one of those people who show us just how far corruption can spread. So Saruman was the leader of the wizards, and the wizards are these beings who are actually put into Middle Earth to be guides to the I'm trying not to like totally
they're just
geek out.
Sure.
But
I know you're capable of geek out when you're making a distinction between different hobbits and different kinds of elves,
Yeah.
In the history of Middle Earth. You totally got geek capabilities.
Yeah.
So we'll do another podcast again on Lord of the Rings since you know so much. But the wizards. Back to the wizards, yeah.
Yeah, so the wizards they're really these guys for the good beings in Middle Earth, the children of Iluvatar, as they might be called. But they're trying to guide them to, really make sure that the influence of Sauron, who's actually the same kind of being as the wizards are, to make sure that influence doesn't spread throughout the other beings in the world in Middle Earth.
They're like watchmen.
Yeah.
Or guardians. In Ezekiel, you have the watchmen of Israel, and if you don't prevent other people from sinning, you even have their blood on your hands.
Yeah.
They're like watchmen in these towers, and so you see bishops in the church having that type of role, like bishops and monks.
Yeah.
Having that sort of type of role that are very wizard-like in Middle Earth.
Yeah. I mean, that's where the beards come from.
Yeah, exactly.
But Saruman, really, his mind gets turned away from this role of stewarding the world around him, and gets turned into looking at, how can I exercise my influence into the world in a way that's going to really just benefit me without thought about the other beings. And when this happens, I mean, you see that he turns away from these visions of good and evil. He says, when you break the light, because he saw him in the white, so when you break the white light, it becomes the many colors, and you see that, there's not just pure good and pure evil. We have to think about this in a more complex level. And the effects of this, more complex, enlightened way of thinking are seen in the transformation of Isengard from this area that was full of beautiful gardens and forests.
And Ents. Walking magical trees.
Gets turned into this kind of desolate, industrially minded pit, so that way he can create the things he needs to do to expand his influence over the good things in the world. And he brings in and corrupts the men who were there serving along with him, and the men start working alongside the orcs, and really, then his influence even spreads out all the way to the Shire.
Right.
right? And that's kind of the thing that the hobbits discover. This is lost in the movies, but when the hobbits return to the Shire, they discover that it's been transformed, and this beautiful Shire that they had seen has now become this industrially focused area, and the hobbits are really viewed as slave labor in order to bring about more food production, and they're doing great. You know, economically, they're doing great. They're exporting their food beyond just the Shire. They're exporting it all over the world now, and it's so nice because they've had so much economic development. But in reality, what we see is that the entire structure has been destroyed.
Yeah. That'd make a really good sort of like I don't want to get into talking about Rings of Power, but what I'm saying is like it could be like Peter Jackson probably couldn't have added like a fifth ending to Return of the King.
I get why they didn't touch on it, but it's so important.
It is story. One of my favorite parts of the novel, and it's like I really hope that maybe someday there'll be some kind of short film.
Oh yeah.
Or like it could even be like a mini series. Now, of course, assuming that it's well done, and they get it, but it would be a pretty cool, like, okay, this is what happened when the hobbits came back.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be? And
there's 6 episodes really would, you know.
Like how they did with Obi-Wan Kenobi and like Darth Vader. That wasn't that bad of a series. It was like pretty decent. I mean, you could critique it, but you could do something like that.
There was like 2 really good hours in there in the 6 hours that they created.
Yes. I could watch the Obi-Wan Kenobi versus Darth Vader fight scene.
Oh yeah,
several times over.
That was incredible.
Yeah.
There were moments in it that were just brilliant.
Yeah, I thought so too. So you could do that with the ending of the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, you could. And they come back and they discover, you know, that there's a hobbit kind of at the head of it, allegedly, who's ordering this industrial production. But behind that hobbit is Saruman disguised.
The fallen Saruman who's been stripped of his power.
Yeah.
Who's actually weak.
Yeah.
But they think he's still strong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that influence then kind of spreads and corrupts everything kind of around it.
So how this relates to our topic though is that the hobbits, as they come back, Middle Earth has been saved.
Mm-hmm.
But they still have a lot of work to do in helping the land heal. Helping creation itself heal. And I think in some ways Tolkien is also talking about Jesus Christ, how in some sense the victory has been won, but it hasn't been fully carried out, and we have a role to be not only co-creators in creation, but also co-redeemers, kind of a dangerous word, but like, you know, co-workers in the sense of helping heal creation and heal one another.
Yeah. That's really what we're being called to do, is work in that restoration, and part of that restoration is getting that view of development, right, back into a good way of thinking.
So let's move on. We've been in Middle Earth for a while now. Can we build? Do you think that there's a way that we can actually get to a place where we're actually creating in harmony with God's creation in the same way that we see the elves? I was a part of a project here. I worked for an environmental center, nature center, for a couple of years, and we were doing the Living Building Challenge, which is regenerative design. A lot of people have heard of LEED, and those standards. Well, Living Building Challenge was like LEED on steroids. And you have to basically build in harmony with creation, essentially. Create your own power. You have all these design requirements to let in enough natural light. You have to produce all of your own energy. The certification is crazy, and I was a part of that project. But anyways, the whole goal really was, in some ways, to build like the elves. I thought about this like quite a bit when I was going to work every day. Because in reality, I was doing a lot of calling of manufacturers. Like, what kind of ingredients are in your product? Because we can't have these 14 red listed ingredients. Of course, they don't want to tell me. So I was doing kind of like, I felt like a telemarketer. Like I'm calling a manufacturer who doesn't want to tell me something, but we need to know if we can use their product or not. So it was very laborious. It was kind of grueling process. Yet I thought about Genesis 1. Revelation 21 and 22, and I thought about the elves quite a bit to kind of get me through it.
Yeah.
We're building in harmony. Do you think that there's a way forward for man to do this? Maybe not perfectly, because Jesus hasn't come back yet, but is there a way for us to make some progress?
I think that there has to be a way to make some progress. I wish that I had all the answers on how to do that, especially when it comes to development. Because when you're looking at like, well, what does a sustainable city look like? I think that this vision of everybody having land that they're producing their own food on, then they're producing their own power on. I haven't done the math, but I am doubtful that every single person in the country could have, their own homestead with their own acre where they're
the Chesterton model of like everybody having a couple acres and a cow.
Yeah, and frankly, like a lot of people don't have the skills to do that. They don't have the knowledge. I mean, I don't have the knowledge right now. And so I think that there has to be more things that we can do. I think that one of the great things is having more people in their work asking, what's going into the things that we make? Like asking that question of like, yeah, you have this product, but like, is it good? Is it well made? I think that is going to be one of those challenges. I have a friend who, he works in medical devices and everything they do is involving plastics. But through his own advocacy in his company, he's gotten it to turn into that a lot of the products that they're making now are made with recycled plastics. So it's like, some of it is like 50% recycled, some of it's 20% recycled, depending on, what the requirements of that product is. But he's able to ask like, can we do something to make this more sustainable? I think that's like more people asking those kinds of questions in their own places of work and their own businesses would help to get us further along that way. But then you get into like, how much arable land is there? How many, like, can we all really like burn wood for heat? Like how much wood would that be? What would that require? We'd have to, really cut down lots of woodland to do that.
Our lifestyles would have to significantly change. Our cities and landscapes, how they're all designed, would have to significantly change.
Yes.
For us to really get to these points. So our skills, our lifestyle and our skill set and our cities would all have to change.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that, that I work with, I don't know if we talked about my work at all.
Not yet. I was going to get to that.
We'll get to it.
Yeah. But feel free to start talking about it right now. That's great.
One of the things, I work with an organization called Citizens Climate, and we look at, kind of ways to bridge the partisan divide when it comes to talking about environmental issues. So oftentimes we see the environment as a left issue, but I think that as Christians we need to recognize that like, no, this is a faith issue. This is a God issue. And it's not a faith-based organization, although lots of the people involved in it are religious, from kind of across the worlds of religion.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that we have as our policy agendas is healthy forests. So we are looking at policies kind of to help promote healthy forests, both urban, rural forests, our more traditional forests, making sure that they're healthy, being done in a sustainable way. Because when the forests are healthier and aren't just produced in a monoculture, they actually are absorbing more carbon out of the air and all these things. But we also want to look at urban forests, right? So like recognizing all the benefits that it brings when like we don't just have these barren urban landscapes, but landscapes that are filled with, trees and green spaces. It has all kinds of effects, like those on mental health.
Yeah.
Obviously it actually cleans the air in the city. So there's like those air cleansing benefits. It makes the city cooler because concrete absorbs tons of heat. So on a hot day, the temperature, the weatherman might be telling you, oh, it's 90 degrees outside, but in your area without any green space, it's more like 110.
Yeah, like in Houston, it's like 110 degrees because like I think Houston's kind of the model of a city of like, complete disaster when it came to city planning, both with like how to get rid of water, but also just like putting concrete literally everywhere. So Houston's an example of like it being also, I think, really hot.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but you can reduce the temperature in a city by like more than 10 degrees by having a green space.
I worked with high-risk youth who were also often urban, and so I have a big passion for helping people have their dignity in some sense restored. There's nothing like living in an urban area and having access to safe green spaces to play, to pray. When you've had a fight inside your home, being able to have somewhere to go, like on a little walk, is very important for your mental health and developing coping skills. So I love sort of like ecotherapy as well.
Yeah.
So it has all these other benefits, but it also just for that reason is enough reason to do it.
Right. And I think that's one of those things that really goes back to is like, this is part of what living in a right balance is, right? Like it has, like, it's not just a single benefit because it's about restoring the way that like humans are supposed to live. So like it brings us as people back into order as we're,
fully integrated.
Yeah.
When things get out of whack, we become fragmented. So we put, this topic in this silo and then this topic in this silo. I mean, our universities are sort of even built like this. Siloed thinking and our whole way of life is fragmented. And I view like the symbol of hell as fragmentation, right? Like think about Christ gives the image of hell as destruction and death, both which represent fragmentation. Destruction is things falling apart. Death, the body is decaying and it falling apart.
Yeah.
Whereas life is integration. The symbol of heaven is becoming a fully integrated human being.
Yes.
And being filled with God's life, which completes us as human beings.
Yeah.
So we become not just persons of integrity, which means like your virtue and moral life is all transparent. What you see is what you get. That's being a person of integrity. But being a fully integrated person and creating an integrated world is the work of heaven.
Yeah.
And that's how I view heaven and hell.
Yeah.
And they're fighting over earth.
Right.
Yeah.
Not to, totally focus on Lewis and Tolkien this entire time, but like I think that those images are captured both in Lewis and Tolkien. So in The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis,
one of my favorite novels.
Oh, so good.
You're coming back on the show, by the way, after this.
Hell, right, is this area one. It's this barren, disgusting landscape. It's this big city that actually it stretches on endlessly. And it's hard to find historical figures because people are fragmented and they want to be away from everyone. Yeah. So they're just like, they're trying to get as far away from people as possible. So like the longer you're there, the farther you are away from others. When you get to heaven, you see, kind of like on the outskirts of heaven, it's this beautiful green, area where, there's the integration between nature and humanity and there's animals present, but they're animals the way they're meant to be. They're even better than they were on Earth.
That's right.
And to go to Tolkien, this is part of for his beautiful short story Leaf by Niggle, that integration between the mind and this way of cooperating with nature. So Niggle is an artist. He's always in the world of thought, and
cold ideas. Remember that?
He's got the cold ideas. He draws about nature. He's working on this beautiful tree that he puts all his time into, where he wants to capture every aspect of the beauty of the tree. And then he has his neighbor Parrish, who is not a man of intelligence, but he is really devoted to taking care of the earth. And so, as Niggle is going through this process of purgatory, where he's being restored to what he was always meant to be, part of that is he finds himself in a garden, and he now, as kind of his final sense of healing, he needs to learn how to garden. And that's where Parrish comes in. They join their work together in order to integrate these two things. So I think that Not exactly sure exactly where we
Well,
had started on that. But
they're in the process of being fully integrated.
Yes.
And becoming healed
that's what it
themselves.
was.
But then Lewis and Tolkien in Great Divorce and Leaf by Niggle also...
It was the visions of heaven and hell, and
Yeah.
the healing from that
Exactly.
comes through this reintegration between man and nature.
Yeah. So healing is happening in this life, but Lewis and Tolkien are also open to like healing happening in the next life as well, like in stages. And so with those two novels, they're actually really pulling on a lot of like Desert Father spirituality of the threefold way. Like so the first level is purification or the purgative way. The second layer is like illumination. And the third layer is like theosis or the unitive way. And so you actually see those three levels in both those fictional works. And it's all about becoming a fully alive human being.
Yes.
Fully integrated. That'll have to be an entirely different show. But they're both pulling on the great monastic tradition of becoming Adam again, or becoming like Christ.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, that's great. So let's get on to some more practical matters. This is the part of the interview where we'll talk about maybe some topics that are deeply affecting our world. I think about the problem of forever chemicals and like microplastics, that type of issue, or the acidification, carbonation of our oceans. Let's start with maybe like microplastics, which connects to consumerism.
Yeah.
Like we used to have to always put things in glass jars, which wasn't a problem because if you throw out a glass jar, it just essentially is a rock, like sand.
Yeah.
How we make glass. But we created plastics, and it was really this super cool thing. I mean, I don't want to like bash it because we've made medical devices and it allowed for the quick transportation of food, and all sorts of things. It's lightweight compared to glass.
Yeah.
At the same time, it breaks down very quickly, but it never breaks down. That's the issue. Is it breaks quickly.
Yeah.
And it doesn't last very long. I mean, just come to my house, with our kids, Christmas time and all the toys and all these plastic things around. I say we've made our world, our home into a plastic place, and I hate it. How do we get away from plastics? What's the solution to... So what's happening is they're all breaking it down into microplastics that never fully break down. So our world is starting to become filled with microplastics. You cut open a fish and it's filled with plastic. What's going on here? What do we do with this type of issue?
Yeah. Well, getting into sustainable packaging and all those things. I mean, people are working on biodegradable plastics. Sometimes those are like actually plant-based materials that do break down, but they can be composted, but they can only be done not like home composting where you just are like tossing it onto a pile and just kind of all breaks down. They have to be in like high heat environments. It can really only happen at an industrial level,
which doesn't seem practical. That's not going to break down in the ocean.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think that for that, I mean, we do have to really kind of get into this idea of, for Christians who want to get away from it, I mean, I do think that we need to look at the issue of like wanting to get into like Christian poverty and viewing like, this constant accumulation of things in a Christian point of view is actually not good. Mm-hmm. We live in an economy that tells us that, the good thing is to always get more and more stuff. And then we have a God who tells us that, if you have two jackets, you need to sell. Actually, that was John the Baptist. But if you have two coats, like you should give your other one away.
Yeah.
And I do think that, Christians really do need to try to find ways to make do with less things and to view that as a virtue.
I mean, our grandparents did.
Yeah.
I mean, they would buy a really high quality suit, and he would wear that, Grandpa would wear that suit every Sunday. and to all major gatherings. It doesn't mean he didn't have several suits. Some grandpas eventually got to that, but the old ways was you just had
I have 3 suits, but the suit I wear the most is the one I got when I was 16.
You just have a couple items, but they're high quality.
High quality, good items. Yeah. Get good things. Like when you do need things, you want to get good things that will last.
Mm-hmm.
And there are like good plastic things, like hard plastics that can be reused over and over again, I think are good.
Definitely different qualities for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's something that requires more thought. Unfortunately, I wish I had answers on what are our alternatives on plastics.
I was not looking for an answer that was going to solve all these, because even like the smartest people in the world, like you can come up with ideas, but we're just not there yet as a society.
And that's why I think that idea of Christian poverty is important, because like I said, focusing on how do we create these biodegradable plastics and all these things, there's there's so much energy, money, and effort being spent into trying to fix the problems that we created. And it's like, okay, but if we were living simply, we didn't need all these things, it would be a much smaller issue.
Consumerism is an addiction. We have to really start thinking of it like that. Christmas was originally about actually, celebrating Christ. And of course you would give little gifts to children, but a lot of it was also giving to other people, like the impoverished. And it had a very big focus of celebration through Thanksgiving and gift. And so it wasn't about us, it was about others.
Yeah.
And we've turned these liturgies and these high feast days of Thanksgiving to God and to helping the poor into black holes. Yeah. They represent our problem throughout the year. Mm-hmm. It's not just Christmas or just these other times of the year. Those are symbols of how we've made Christmas into this consumeristic black hole. And that's how we live, 365 days of the year.
Yeah. Although my house does get much more cluttered after each subsequent Christmas.
Yes,
and now my garage is literally actually full of plastic toys that we can't fit into our house, but don't want to get rid of.
Right, exactly. I'm right there with you, brother. Yeah. But so getting back to, I guess, wooden toys and Dad going out to the shop and making something that's not as cool but lasts forever, and and the kids Dad made this for me,
Yeah, actually, there are things they aren't as cool, but all the plastic toys. My grandpa was a woodworker.
Cool.
And he made some wooden toys, and they're still in our house today because we're not going to get rid of this thing that Grandpa made for us.
Not only are they high quality, cool. They have an intrinsic meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's so cool. Yeah. That's a good example. And so it's not like us solving every issue, but it is solving the issue in us.
Yeah.
Which is a spiritual problem, but it manifests itself in the material world.
Yeah. And it causes real issues. The microplastics and these things, have been linked to cancer in animals and in fish. It's linked to those plastics then find their way into our food system, and they find their way into our bodies. And they've been linked to issues in fertility.
Right.
And we've actually seen generational declines in sperm counts. And when I found this out, that male sperm counts were declining, having each generation since the 1970s, it's I was like, well, this is an absolutely horrible thing. Have we figured out what it is? And it's we've known for about 10 years that it comes from this thing called phthalates. Mm-hmm. And it makes, people are saying, oh, we're reaching a point where maybe we won't be able to reproduce without things like IVF. Mm-hmm. And, for Catholics, that's very problematic because, and I don't know if the Orthodox Church is against IVF as well, but that becomes problematic, right? And it's well, we're talking about, are there even ways to reproduce that would be moral? And it seems like we should try to get away from that as quickly as possible.
Well, our way of life, which is consumeristic, or even just big manufacturers not caring, they have, I think
we should say, why doesn't the government step in? But it's also you should look at why aren't manufacturers, when learning that their products are doing this, not saying, oh, we need to do something immediately.
I would have a hard time being a Christian and being a CEO of a huge manufacturing company for many of them. And there's a reason why. They probably wouldn't want me there. But there is a whole Christian ethic, and manufacturers really need to take personal responsibility for this, and that is, and I learned this through calling manufacturers quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
They know what's in their product, and I understand why it's hard. It's really hard to change the way you do something because you could lose money, and you have to. It involves the world changing.
Yeah.
And so I'm not trying to be too hard on them because it is complex, and it involves global trade. But when you know you are putting a chemical in an item that causes all these problems, and there's a totally replaceable chemical that you can use that's just as cheap, but you just don't do it, I don't know how you sleep at night. You know?
Yeah.
Like you don't have to make skillets with the black coating. That is a forever chemical.
Yeah.
You know, there's other ways of making skillets.
Yeah.
Like, so that this, you know, when you've got a skillet with black coating and that stuff starts coming off, and that's a forever chemical.
Yeah.
Or our bodies. The restaurants that give you those black boxes, you know, they look fancy, right? The styrofoam that's black instead of white. But they contain those forever chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
Literally in the food, the nice restaurant you went to on a date contains forever chemicals in that box. We don't have to do life that way.
Right.
You know, there's paper boxes that you could take home.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And then,
sorry, I don't mean to freak you out, but
no, I know it's crazy.
It's crazy. And those are major ethical concerns when you look at the world as a temple, as a temple. And so if you look at Genesis 1 as procreation being part, like us being able to have the ability to procreate, which is a way of co-creating with God, having children, and we're creating a world where that may not be possible, we should be deeply alarmed. Deeply alarmed. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you get into the issue also of ocean acidification. Right?
Yeah, so ocean acidification. So unpack that because not everybody will really know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So you hear about carbon emissions a lot. And, you know, carbon is it's consumed by plants and all living things. Like carbon is actually needed for life. But because our main ways of producing energy that our world runs on and we can't get away from and is powering most of the stuff here, is getting put out into the world at such much higher levels than, ever has been before. A lot of this gets absorbed by trees. About 30% of it gets absorbed by our oceans. And our oceans are reaching a level where it's becoming acidic, and it's becoming that carbon that goes into your soda is it's like the ocean is like you said, it's becoming carbonized.
Like a soda can. Like our oceans are becoming like soda.
Yeah.
And that's why there's bleaching on the coral reefs because of right? Is it the bleaching of
the bleaching of the coral reefs because they
related to that, yeah.
All these things that have these skeletal structures, so coral reefs and the shells of mollusks and crabs and stuff like that, they have trouble forming when our ocean is becoming so acidified. So we're having this fourth wave of massive coral reef bleaching. And I mean, for me, this was actually another non-theological pivotal moment. Was I went on a scuba diving trip when I was 14 in the Florida Keys. I saw the coral reefs and I was just kind of stunned by this natural beauty that's really on kind of this whole other level.
Cries out with the glory of God.
Yeah,
right?
and at this it was a Boy Scout base that's a venture base, the High Sea Adventure base there, and they had a thing where we would go there, and in the mornings, if you woke up extra early, there was this daily worship chapel that they had, and I was going there, and then one day we learned about the bleaching of the reefs during the chapel, and I was sitting here and I was seeing, and we even saw some coral reef bleaching where we were scuba diving, and it was because our oceans are becoming over carbonized. We're losing this thing that is calling out to the glory of God, and it's what are we doing? We need to change our ways here, and it's more than just losing this like thing that is naturally beautiful. It also is the home of, lots of basic forms of ocean life that are all part of this food chain. And I think that, the lessons that we're learning from, Tolkien and the effects of getting away from being in harmony with creation is like, it's only a matter of time before, having our whole ocean food chains disrupted won't come back to like bite us.
Oh yeah.
So,
species collapse affects food.
yes.
And I always tell people, you may not really care about all these environmental issues, but I bet you care about food.
Yeah.
Right? Like, what human being doesn't care about food?
Yeah, I need food.
I need food.
Food doesn't
live.
just come from the grocery store. It has to come from somewhere else.
And biodiversity and overlapping ecosystems and the whole pattern of life that we have in our oceans and forests. And I mean, there's even farmers who are beginning to cut out a part of their field to add forest or prairie. So they have more pollinators pollinating their crops.
Yeah.
Why? Because the ecosystem is kind of important in yielding bigger crops. Yeah. Can you like load up fertilizers and load up stuff to like maximize productions?
For a little while.
In a short term.
Yeah.
But not in the long term. And so we need to be feeding our pollinators. And so running prairies through your fields is deeply important for yields.
Yeah. Yeah. And doing all those things will help to keep, more carbon into the land.
Sure.
And keep it, out of the oceans, out of the air, which has other effects.
I always say that, like, even if you don't think, you have Christians who are really torn about this like whole climate change topic. Okay, it's a loaded term. I mean, people probably just get angry with the phrase. I just said it. And some people might even on the comments on YouTube, which everybody just has all sorts of opinions. It's like
very well thought out opinions.
Very well thought out. The best reading is YouTube comments.
Yeah.
But anyways, it's a very divisive issue. It's a trigger word. But I think when we start breaking down, okay, what's happening in creation in God's temple, right? Whenever you get too much of something, it can throw you off. I always give the example of there was this contest where someone was going to be given a car, and I think they chose 4 or 5 people.
Mm-hmm.
And all they had to do was just put their hand on the car for, I don't know how many hours it was, 48 hours or something. And each person just had to stand there and hold on to the car. But in the old days, I guess they couldn't use the bathroom. Okay, so you've got these people who are drinking water. They're still like human beings that need to live, but they won't let go of this car. And a woman dies from it.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of this. Yeah,
she's drinking water, but her body's not getting rid of what it's supposed to get rid of. And so water, like the gift of life, right? Like no water, no life, actually is the very thing that poisons her.
Yeah.
And so good things can poison us. And so when you have too much of something and just anything, really, you lose homeostasis, the balance that we're supposed to have in our bodies. You eat too much of one thing, even if it's good, can throw you off.
Yeah.
Can throw you off. And so it's the same issue with this carbon in the oceans, which is leading to acidification, eroding skeletal systems, and then boom, species collapse. And so we have to care about this issue if we care about our kids. Yeah.
Yeah, which is where, it gets into the issue of talking about climate change, and then you lead to, it also, carbon has this capacity of giving life, but also has this, very well established, has since the 18th or the 19th century, they found that, carbon also has this ability to trap heat. So when we're taking all this carbon, which has largely been stored in the ground, and now it's being put out into the air, it's trapping all that heat. And again, that homeostasis gets thrown off, and it should not be hard to imagine how the effects that we're putting out into the world are then having this destabilizing effect. It's having this effect in ways that it's throwing off our fertility systems. It's throwing off our food chains. It's throwing off, it can also throw off our temperatures, which then causes all kinds of other effects.
Sure.
our glaciers just start melting at unprecedented rates and leads to mass species extinction and all these things.
So we have a problem. There's a problem there, but the solutions are complex, and this is where I think there ends up being a very sort of bitter divide. A lot of times it's like economic solutions can get really bitter because, hey, we have, if you're in West Virginia, which is mining and coal country, what are you supposed to do?
Right.
Or places in Montana or Minnesota, it's like people are losing their jobs. What are they supposed to go do? And so there is this really does matter.
Yeah.
Because we also care about those people and they need to have jobs. And so it gets into a lot of bitter economic divides, and I think that is where it gets a lot more heated.
Yeah.
Heated, because what are you supposed to do when some people are giving more like socialist solutions of like creating a global economic system of trading credits and all this, and so that looks different than what we were talking about earlier, right? Of local economics.
Yeah.
G.K. Chesterton and Tolkien and Dorothy Sayers, all these players are passionate about local economics and what you can do locally having a priority of what can be done globally. Now our world is globally is doing what we should be doing locally.
Right.
And so this relates to this whole conversation. I'm not saying we're going to solve it in this conversation, but I'm trying to play a little bit of devil's advocate for people who are listening. Like, okay, climate change or carbon. Yes. Okay, it's happening, but I don't agree with what's being proposed to fix it all. What do we say as Christians?
Yeah, well, I think that being united in just the fact that we can embrace this lost call to Christian poverty, to this lost call of fasting. If we, were to bring up this call of fasting weekly or even twice a week.
Wednesdays and Fridays preferably.
Wednesdays and Fridays, as some people would say. Yeah.
Exodus 90 does it too. They do Wednesdays and Fridays too.
Yeah, or even if you look at the classical practice among Catholics when it came to fasting, having like hard fasts every Friday instead of just Ash Wednesday and just Good Friday. Like if
no meat, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if everyone was doing that, some people have talked about, we should have like meatless Mondays, and it's like, well, we used to do this thing called meatless Fridays, or I try to only eat one meal a day on Fridays, as a fast, and if people are doing that, I mean, that's going to have a major. If we had, if there were millions or 2 billion Christians doing that, I mean, that would have a massive effect on the global economy, the way all food production is happening. But going beyond that, I do think that, you can kind of compare this to other issues of how do we can look at policies, right? And we can get united around some good policies when it comes to taking care of these problems. So one things that, actually Indiana's own Senator Mike Braun has worked on is making it easier to have these markets where farmers get paid through people who want to offset their own carbon emissions, businesses who want to offset their carbon emissions. They'll pay farmers and private forest owners to do these kinds of good practices, like having prairies run through their farmland, planting cover crops so that way you're preventing lots of soil erosion. It keeps a lot more carbon into the ground.
Yeah.
And that's happening through private investment, incentivizing the kind of good land practices that, have all kinds of other benefits as well, help to bring about better yields.
And more fish in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
Because I would explain this to my students when I taught theology, but we go into different sections of eco-theology and talking about how everything's connected. And, the things that we do in the Midwest actually affect the shrimp fishermen in the Gulf of Mexico. And there's, the Mississippi River flows out there, and there's a growing mass of water without oxygen. Mm-hmm. And this is growing day by day because of all the fertilizers and pesticides flowing into that spot. And so life can't grow there. And as Christians, we have to care about our fellow man in the Gulf of Mexico, those poor shrimp farmers or whatever.
Right.
That is a type of caring and loving for our neighbor. And so it doesn't mean we have all the solutions overnight about how to like redo crops, but even something as simple as crop covers.
Yeah.
Or not relying on fertilizers for every type of growth.
Yeah.
Is a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then other things, like with other kinds of pollution, right? Like we place a fee on having trash pickup because we recognize like it's not good for like our communities to have it like filled up with heaping piles of trash. So like you pay for someone to come and haul it away. But for other forms of pollution, like carbon pollution, one of the things that like people in my work advocate for is kind of actually drawing from, conservative libertarian, really, economist Milton Friedman is saying, if you want less of something, like have people pay for it. So like right now we have carbon getting pumped up into the air for free, and there's no cost associated with that carbon. Like we wouldn't allow that with other kinds of trash, and it actually controls the amount of trash that you are going to be putting out. Like if I in my house am doing more than filling up my weekly curbside bin every single week, I need to actually pay for my excess trash to get hauled away. Well, we advocate for a price on carbon emissions that happen by the people who put it out. And that allows, ways of people, once that kind of adding that price of carbon into the market, now you get people looking for ways through their own investments, through their own innovations, to find ways to make sure that we're using less carbon emissions. And it brings about innovation. And it's really been advocated for by pretty much all economists across the political spectrum as the most economically efficient way to reduce those carbon emissions, addressing things like the carbon in our atmosphere as well as carbon in our oceans, all these things.
I mean, we do it with a lot of other topics that are not controversial. Like if your manufacturing company has some kind of excess that's not good, you have to like transport it and pay for it and get rid of it.
Yeah.
In all sorts of ways. Everybody agrees with that.
Yeah.
This carbon thing is complicated though. I think to play devil's advocate, and probably what people might be thinking when they're listening is like, yeah, what that means though is if the United States does something like that, it just means more lost jobs because China's not going to, India's not going to, other countries won't. And then we just lose jobs because we're paying more again for more regulations. Like, and it's a legitimate critique. It's a hard one. It's a hard one to answer.
Yeah, well, I mean, we do get at that by looking at things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which is essentially what it is you take that same carbon fee that happens domestically and you place it on your imports too. So like China would not get away with the fact that they're producing their products in a much more unclean, less sustainable way than we do here. So
because
that would
you
actually
put more tariffs on their imports or something, or
yeah,
okay,
essentially. So that would encourage China as well, because when they would decrease their amount of carbon emissions, they would pay less of a fee when they're doing business with one of their largest trading partners.
What if you reach this level of so many microplastics in the world? When it comes to sacraments, we think of like using pure bread. Can you reach a point where it's like, ooh, I wonder if we can make it, would it lead to an invalid sacrament, or is it getting to a point where we should think about these things? I
think that we should definitely be thinking about that. I mean, there's something like really, I think, almost like blasphemous in the idea of like, when in the liturgy, in the simplified daily mass liturgy, we say, we're offering up for the earth the work of human hands, and it's like the work of human hands plus these forever chemicals that we created through a petroleum product. I don't know. I love the idea of monks, having as their particular calling, like having this like perfectly virgin soil and making like testing it to make sure it's free from microplastics, and the wheat they produce then gets used for liturgy. I think that would be like a really cool idea. There's something very romantic about it, but
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Really caring about the soil from which you grow the sacraments. And sacraments, of course, are a good sign and symbol of what it means for heaven and earth to be united.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it would also provide like an interest. Like some people would be like, "Oh man, that's so silly that you're like putting so much work and care into that," but like other people would be like, "Wow, like they really care about the things that are going into this most holy offering to God."
I think even if we pass some kind of threshold, that Jesus will still come into our messiness. With the sacraments, we've tried to offer our best to God. But even if it has these microplastics, we don't want to be obsessively thinking like, "Oh, Christ isn't going to come." He came into our own messy world,
Yeah.
But
true.
I think it's important to offer up our best.
Yeah.
I think about like the water we use for holy baptism, the elements you use for holy chrism, the Eucharist, all these elements you want to offer up to God. And if you intentionally add something that's not supposed to be in there, it does make it invalid. If you intentionally do it.
Yeah.
But
if it's unintentional.
If it's unintentional, it doesn't. But we should still have this seriousness of offering our best fruits to God. I mean, that starts off in Genesis, chapter 3 or 4 with Abel, Cain and Abel, like offering your best to God. And that's the idea of a sacrifice. And so if we're offering up all of creation to God, and then he returns by giving himself to us in the Eucharist, then it makes sense that even trying to like eliminate microplastics, forever chemicals, these things that are always kind of like invading everything, we should do our best to sort of fight that and bring back a world. Even if we can't make it entirely pure, getting it back to a better place would be good.
Yeah. Great place to start.
Yeah.
Is with that which we use for the sacraments.
Yeah. Isn't that a random question? It just popped in my head one day. Like, whoa.
Yeah. No. I love that question. Well, it's an interesting thing because, like, I mean, there was a scandal when there was this parish discovered that they were using wine that had blueberry juice mixed in with it, which makes the sacrament invalid.
Sure.
And this because it has to be the pure juice of the grape. That gets into like weird questions there in the sense of like,
sure,
at what level is like the intention matter, but. Yeah, care needs to be used with the things that we use.
I mean, we're not baptizing people in like Coca-Cola or Jell-O. I mean, there is kind of like this meaning of the symbol.
Yeah,
that does become real. And I understand it can look, when you get into the nitty-gritty, it can look a little legalistic, like the different kinds of fruit and stuff like that. But for Orthodox and Catholics, it actually is quite important that we follow the modes and the signs and symbols that Christ gave, and that's how we enter into the story. So it's deeply important, and so those questions do relate. Even in the early church, I think there were people that were starting to mix like honey, and they were starting to mix other things, and the church said, no, just bread.
Yeah,
offer up bread. So, well, I liked your answer. Thank you for answering it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
It's been great having you on the show.
Yeah, it's been great to be here.
It's fun to see like you care about Scripture and our Lord, and also what that means for creation care. But you can also nerd out on some Tolkien.
Oh, yeah.
Lewis,
yeah. Exactly. I mean, but it was Tolkien and Lewis that really brought me into this and was like, surely there's a way we can do this without selling the farm on policy.
Right.
Right?
Right. Yeah, amen. And so, guys, I hope after this interview you're challenged to think more deeply about the creation that our Lord has given us. I hope that you take more seriously our call to, like, view creation as a temple, as an act of worship, to also care for it and pass it on to our next generation. Michael, I just want to thank you for coming out to the show. Definitely subscribe to his Substack, Good Steward. Yeah, The Good Steward.
Yeah, The Good Steward. Check that out.
Which will be linked in the bottom of the description of this video, so you can check it out, see what he's up to in the writing world. I definitely have some interaction with him for sure. And also, don't forget to like and subscribe to this video. And if you like this content, don't forget to like and, hey, make a comment on there too. Whether you love the video or not, make a little comment. Maybe you didn't like our talk about climate change. Well, let us know and see how we can talk about it in a different way.
Yeah, and if the climate change is an issue that you're interested in engaging on a policy perspective, I would really encourage you to go and look into the organization I work with. If you're looking for a place where you can engage as an authentic, a conservative Christian, whether we're kind of wherever from the denominational perspectives you're coming from. If you're looking for a place to engage with that, I would highly encourage you to look into Citizens Climate. You might find us under Citizens Climate Lobby, and just look into our policy agendas. We have action teams with conservatives. We have a Catholic action team. We have every kind of denomination under the sun. I don't know if we have an Orthodox action team, but
I'll help lead it.
You can always start one. Where people kind of engage on this at that kind of level, and can help to get more conservative politicians thinking more deeply about what are the ways in which we can guide in free market principles and getting us to have a more sustainable economy.
Yeah, and if you're looking for a good book, I recommend this book. It's called Creation as Sacrament, and I know that actually I've had Protestant friends really enjoy it too. But really great work by an Orthodox bishop that really ties in the Catholic Orthodox sort of heritage on creation care and looking at creation as a temple and a sacrament. So you'll love this work if you've liked this interview. But yeah, you guys have a great day. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.